guys, it's Kim Dellow here, and this week I am talking about stencils. Now these two stencils are from StencilGirl and they're designed by Seth Apter. We've got the Alpha Drips stencil and the Number Drip stencil, and as you can see they work perfectly together. So what I thought I'd do, I thought I would challenge myself to come up with 5 ways of using just these two stencils to make a background. And I've got a couple of old favourite methods that we all love and we all use, but there's a couple of my personal favourites in there as well, so I hope you enjoy them. But what I really want to know is what your favourite ways of using stencils are, so please do leave me a comment on my YouTube channel. And if you don't know my YouTube channel, if you're watching this on the StencilGirl blog, then come and find me. You can just search for Kim Dellow in YouTube and there I'll be. And whilst you're there, don't forget to like my video and also subscribe to my channel because I bring out new art and craft based videos every week. Okay, shall we get on with it then? So 5 ways of using these two stencils to make a background and a whole finished art journal page for you as well.
So let's start off with one of my favourite techniques, and that is stencil printing. I'm going to use the simplest method for stencil printing today, and that is just to cover one side of the stencil with paint and press it into the paper. You can use all sorts of paints and inks for this technique, but today I'm actually going to use some heavy-bodied acrylic paint. But the look I'm going for with this first layer is quite a watercolour effect. So yes, heavy-body acrylic paint is probably not the best paint for this particular effect, and a soft body or an acrylic ink would work really well. However, I don't have the colours in either of those, and I do have the colours in heavy body, so that's why I'm using heavy body acrylic paint. I could of course use watercolour paint, but we all know that as you layer up watercolour paint, it still reacts with each layer, so as you change the colours as you go through the layers, you're more likely to get a mixing of the colours and perhaps a mud look at the end. But I don't want to have to worry about that. I just want each colour to stay clean all the way through as I add colours on top. But, spoiler alert, I will be using watercolour at the end. So, how do you make heavy body acrylic paint more watercolour-y? Is that a thing? Watercolour-y? Watercolour-like. Simple, you just change its consistency. Now, if this was a painting that I wanted to sell on and I wanted it to last a long time and there'd be no worries about the paint coming off the surface or anything like that, then I would consider using an acrylic medium to do my diluting down with. But I'm not. It's just an art journal page. It doesn't really matter what happens to it afterwards. It's going to be photographed and then it's kind of gone. So I'm just using water to do the diluting down here. The trick is just to mix it really, really, really well. I can't overstress that. Really well. Acrylic paint can go a little bit lumpy when you add water to it, and you just want to get a really smooth, liquidy, fluidy paint. So mix and keep mixing. And then I'm going to cover a brayer with the paint and roll the paint onto the stencil. Now you want to be sure which way up your stencil is going to be, so I want the letters to look the right way round. So I'm adding my paint to the back of my stencil. So if you've got any words or letters or numbers on your stencils, just bear that in mind. Remember which way up you want it to be. And for extra wateriness, I've sometimes been spraying the paint that's on the stencil with water before I press it into the paper. And if I show you a close-up of the print, you can see how effective this technique is. You've got lots of lovely textures. You've got that watercolour look, but matched with it, you've also got the bobble effect that you get when you press acrylic paint into a surface. And then you have the pattern of the stencil as well. So a really great technique. Okay, so let's move on to technique number 2. And this is an old favourite. Most people know this one, and it is using a sponge to apply paint through a stencil. Now this is a great way of using a stencil to get a very clear image, and you don't have to use the whole stencil. You can be very precise with this one and just use part of the stencil if you want. So I'm going to build up this layer one letter or number at a time. And for this all I'm using is a cut up piece of kitchen sponge. So just an ordinary washing up sponge, nothing fancy. And if you want a further tip, if you wash out your sponge before the acrylic paint has dried, you can use it again and again and again. Well, until it falls to pieces, that is. And yes, I am that stingy. Or should we just say careful with money? I mean, given the choice between spending your money on sponges or spending your money on stencils, not a difficult choice. Now the trick with this particular technique, if you've never done this before, is to make sure you have a really small amount of paint on your sponge. Too much paint and it splodges underneath the stencil, which can lead to a bit of a mess when you lift up the stencil. Now there are occasions when you might actually not be that bothered about that mess, but on this particular occasion I want a really clean image. So I'm making sure that I have no excess paint on my sponge. It's just a really small amount, and I'm doing this by picking up a small amount in the first place and then tapping off the excess on my palette. Or you can use a spare piece of paper if you want. And this is the same technique you would use if you were using a sponge brush or a stippling brush or any other type of applicator. Okay, well, let's move on to stencil technique number 3, and this one is using gel medium. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually setting up for a gel resist. I'm using a gloss gel, so it's going to dry completely transparent, and when it is dry, it's going to be resistant to water. To apply my gel, I'm just using a plastic card spreader, so this is just an old credit card or an old gift card, something like that, and just thinly spreading the gel over the stencil. Try not to nudge or move the stencil as you're applying the gel, and when you lift it up, just lift it up really carefully so as not to squidge any of the gel underneath the stencil or risk smearing the image. As you've probably noticed, I'm not the best at cleaning up my stencils. I will perhaps, wipe off any wet paint when I'm changing colours, something like that, but usually I just let them be. When it comes to things like gels and texture pastes, however, I will wipe off excess and wash them as well. Mainly because they just will dry quite sharply and they'll gunk up the stencil. So let this layer dry completely, and you can see here, this one's dry, and if I move it around, where it glints and catches the light, that's my gel. You can just about see it, can't you? So how long to leave it to dry will really depend on how thick you put the gel layer down. Mine was quite thin, so it only took a few hours, but if you have a thick layer, then you're going to want to leave it overnight. Technique number 4, and it's spray through, probably one of the most popular ones we're using with stencils because it's really fun. And this is where that watercolour layer that I promised you at the start comes into its own. I'm using a water-based dye ink spray for this layer because it's translucent, and if you remember, we just put that gel resist layer down, and this spray is not going to stick to it, so it's going to really shine through. So I had wanted just a little bit more of the spray detail through the stencil. However, my spray got a little bit clogged up, so I just went straight on to dripping the ink directly onto the surface so that I could really see that lovely gel resist. So I'm just using an eyedropper to move the ink around because you don't actually need an awful lot of the ink itself. And I'm just redistributing it and splattering it and just having fun with it. And as you can see, I've tipped up the piece of paper as well so the ink flows on its own. And you can see the resist and the numbers and the letters that we did in the gel in the previous layer. You can see where they're coming through. And then I'm just drawing some circles roughly with that ink and doing a bit more splattering. So the circle area, now that's going to be the focal point of this design, and you can kind of see it now all starting to come together, each of the layers shining through. I thought a lot about what I was going to use as my focal point. There's a lot of things I could have used. I could have used stars, circles, hearts, but all of these are images that I often turn to, motifs that I use again and again, and I'm trying to break out of that. So what I decided to do in the end was to use one of the flowers I'd drawn in my sketchbook. I scanned them into my computer and then printed them out, and I did an original size and also a larger size. Cut those out and then just played about with which flower I actually wanted to use and what size of flower I wanted to use. And if you follow me on Instagram, then you might have seen these flowers because I did do them as a work in progress on both my main feed and in my stories as well. Once I decided which flower I was going to use, it's time for the 5th and final technique with my stencil, and that is just drawing through the stencil. And I'm using this final technique just to ground the flower. If I put the flower down just on this colourful surface, I mean, we've got pinks and greens in the flower and pinks and greens in the black background as well, but it will still just look like it's just floating there. There's nothing connecting the flower to the background. By using the black line, as there's a lot of black line in the flower image and it's a very open image as well, that's hopefully going to ground the flower so it doesn't look like it's just been plonked there. So I used a fine line marker pen to make this cascade of outline numbers behind the flower, And once I'd put that in place, I then went back over that line with a paint pen. And the paint pen's just a little bit thicker, so you get a more pronounced look. And of course, the paint pen's going to stick to any of the areas where you've got that gel resist, which the fine line marker might not. And the final thing to do is just to stick the flower down. There you go, I've built up my background using the StencilGirl, Seth Apter, Alpha Drips and Number Drip stencils, and I've used 5 different techniques for this background. If you remember, I was using the printing method with the acrylic paint, the sponging method, I did a gel resist and a spray through, and then finally we brought it all together with drawing through the stencil. So I'm totally curious, which one's your favourite and which one will you be using in your next art journal page? Leave me a comment on my YouTube channel to let me know. If you know someone who you think will find this video interesting and useful, then please do share it with them. Also, if you enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, come and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.